And again, the Pacific War is our topic today. We're talking about the Second World War in the Pacific theater as opposed to the European theater. And the last of our lectures. If you missed any of these, then again, you'll be able to see them as of the last week in May if you go to our website. So, I've talked about a number of different pieces of what led to the imperialist approach in Japan, the fact that they became more and more militarized over time, but the point I've started with in several of the lectures is the mid-1860s, between 1866 and 1868, when the Meiji Emperor was restored to his full authority and made the commitment to modernize and mechanize Japan. In a very short time after that, 1894 to 95, the Japanese defeated the Chinese in the First Sino-Japanese War. After gaining control of Korea, supposedly, and also part of Manchuria, the Russians refused to allow Japan to really take advantage of the victory that they had won in the First Sino-Japanese War. And so 1904 and 5, there was the first, I guess it's the first, because in 1945 we have a second war between Russia and Japan when Russia invades Manchuria and comes into Korea in order to battle against the Japanese troops there. But 1904 and 1905, Japan defeats Russia. Korea becomes a Japanese colony, and in 1910 they actually annex it, make it part of Japan, and proceed to try to sort of wipe out the Korean culture so that it will become very much a part of Japan. That's in 1910, and they established themselves then in Manchuria, in China, create a puppet regime in that country called Manchukuo, and end up taking advantage of the resources there as well. Throughout all of this time, it is very much the conviction of Japan that they needed resources in order to be able to survive as a modern country. I've said several times they had very little iron, no oil, no coal. Korea was one place they could get it. They could also get it in Manchuria, in China, but even there, the oil particularly was fairly limited. And so as they went along, because they had invaded China, taken over part of China, they had left the League of Nations when the League of Nations tried to tell them that that was unacceptable, they couldn't do that. The Western powers, particularly the United States, started embargoing the oil deliveries into Japan. They also eventually froze Japan's assets in the United States. And so Japan gets further and further along in the 1930s to believing that they had to take action militarily in order to become the nation that they felt they had a right to become, and really, as they understood it, to defend themselves. They insisted that East Asia for the East Asians was a slogan line, and yet for the most part, they really saw all of East Asia, Korea, China, and later on Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, all of them as sources for material for Japan. And so while they claimed East Asia for East Asians, most people understood that when they heard it to mean East Asia for Japan. In 1941, earlier in the year, in 1941, General Hideki Tojo was made prime minister. All of the political processes in Japan came under a militarized government. There were no other political parties, and so the military at that point was very much running the country. All of that led, as you, I'm sure, are well aware, to the 7th of December of 1941, in which early in the morning on a Sunday, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which was the primary base for the Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy. Whereas they were fighting a land war in China, and the Japanese army was especially concerned about the Chinese and potentially the intervention of the Russians at some point, and they ended up signing a non-aggression treaty with Russia, Soviet Union at this point. When I say Russia, they're still ethnically Russians, and that's just shorthand. It's by the time we're talking about the late 30s, of course, it's the Soviet Union. But they signed a non-aggression pact so that they didn't have to worry about fighting Russia and felt like they could turn their attention to other needs. On the 7th of December, within 7 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, they also had attacked various other U.S. and British controlled areas in Asia, including the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, all three of which were possessions of the United States at that point, and Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, which were controlled by the British, all in one day. They had a comprehensive plan for controlling all of this that had been put together by Yamamoto, military leader in Japan. And at the start of the war, Japan had a navy of 236 ships, that is, warships. All of the Allied powers, including the United States, had 221. So at the start of the Second World War, Japan actually had more naval ships than did the United States. It's important to note that the naval combat in the European theater had been primarily against between battleships. You know, we've got to sink the Bismarck kind of thing, the major battleships. There never really was an adopting of aircraft carriers as a major battle platform in the European war. But right at about 1940, they began to become aware that the air capabilities of an aircraft carrier was actually more powerful than these huge battleships, and that they could deliver more destruction at a greater distance with airplanes taking off from an aircraft carrier than they could even firing shells 30 miles from a battleship. And so the Japanese were one of the very first countries to really get the idea about that. When they attacked Pearl Harbor, their hopes had been to destroy the aircraft carriers and the battleships that were parked in Pearl Harbor as the American naval fleet. They were successful in either sinking 4 of the battleships in Pearl Harbor. They damaged several others. Fortunately, of the 8 battleships that were there, and all of them either damaged or sunk, 4 sunk, 4 damaged, all but 2 ended up being able to be repaired in time to be actively used in the Second World War. The Japanese had not planned on an extended war. They felt like if they did not win the war very quickly, which was the reason for the surprise attacks, if they could not win the war quickly, they did not have the resources to be able to fight an extended battle, an extended war, because they didn't have the resources to rebuild ships, to rebuild planes, to train more pilots. And so that's why they tried to make it a decisive strike all at one time. But the U.S. Navy proved their ability to both repair and to replace materiel as they went along. Yamamoto, the military commander who had designed the attack on Pearl Harbor and on the other main locations around around southern Asia, was quoted as saying, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or year, but I have absolutely no confidence for the second or third years. So for all of this, the attack on Pearl Harbor, even though it did not get any of the aircraft carriers, they were out on maneuver, much to the disappointment of the Japanese. But they did destroy or damage sink or damage 8 battleships, a number of other cruisers, 300 aircraft were destroyed, 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 were wounded. But the aircraft carriers were not damaged because they were not in Pearl Harbor. From the start of that very dramatic series of attacks on May 7th, I've shown you the slide before, the Japanese controlled Manchuria as a puppet regime. They had controlled all of the ports and much of the other territory in the east and northeast of China, which is where most of the population are. And very quickly they took over Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippine Islands. This...
Ross, when you say they took over, did they take over the government?
No, they militarily, they defeated the other governments, so they're controlling them. Their military is in complete control of all those areas. The issue, a government doesn't have any power if their military is defeated. So they defeated the military in all of those cases, and most of those places were Western powers were really the military force there. Britain and the Netherlands, for instance, were primarily the ones, like in Burma, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. All of those were areas that were controlled by Western powers, and they defeated the military of the Western powers, so they were controlling those areas. This was the plan of the Japanese. They wanted to create a defensive barrier here, what they called it the Malay Barrier, and they wanted to continue to extend their control further out into the Pacific Ocean. In particular, the Coral Sea, which is right down here, it's in between the Solomon Islands, Australia, down here, was a major site. Now in this talk, I just want to talk about several of the major kinds of battles that really made a difference in terms of changing the turning points of the war as we went along. This, by April of 1942, so we're talking 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had expanded their control all the way out here, the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the northern Solomon Islands, down all of Sumatra, Java, Indonesia, down in here. Their desire was to extend to this line, this dotted line. That was Yamamoto's plan. That would mean controlling all of the Coral Sea, New Caledonia, Fiji, all the islands down here, as well as far as Midway Island, which was very close to Hawaii. The goal was twofold here. One was to cut off Australia from any contact from the Western powers, since they were an ally to the West. They controlled the seas to the west here, but if they could control all of this area, they in effect would have cut Australia off, so that they would not have, Australia would not have been able to receive support, supplies, etc., and eventually the idea of being able to take over Australia. The goal here from Midway Island was if they could control Midway and make that a base, they would have the ability to attack Hawaii, and from Hawaii, if they were successful there, they then could attack the coast of the United States. So this was Yamamoto's plan, and his first effort to try to make that plan work was the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea was in May of 1942, between the 4th and the 6th of May. And again, the Japanese goal was to control the Coral Sea and therefore cut off Australia from resupply and from support from the West. This is a very important battle for several reasons and a major turning point. Tactically, it was a success for the Japanese because they ended up destroying more Allied ships than the Allies destroyed Japanese ships. But this is the first time, again, 6 months after Pearl Harbor and their victories in Singapore and Hong Kong and elsewhere, this is the first battle in which the Japanese did not accomplish their objective. They had been completely unstoppable until the Battle of the Coral Sea, but prior to this, the American code breakers had managed to break the Japanese code, and so we quite literally were reading their mail. We knew what their plans were. And so an Allied force was sent in, primarily Americans, but there were other Allied ships involved as well, was sent in, that's the blue, so that when the Japanese came in with two forces, their goal was to try to take over Port Moresby on New Guinea, and from there to be able to control this whole region. The Americans surprised them. This not only is noteworthy as a battle because it's the first battle that the Japanese did not accomplish their objectives, but it also is the first battle in history that was fought entirely between aircraft carriers, where it was entirely planes fighting against other planes and other aircraft carriers, and it also was the first sea battle in which the ships on the two sides never saw each other. They were fighting at such a distance with airplanes flying off their decks that they never actually saw one another in this battle. As I mentioned, the Japanese technically were victorious because they managed to damage the USS Lexington, an aircraft carrier of the United States, so much that it had to be scuttled later. They seriously damaged the Yorktown. In fact, the Japanese believed the Yorktown was completely out of commission. It later was repaired, and in fact, in just a little over a month after this, it participated in the Battle of Midway. So they were very quick at being able to repair it. The U.S. sank a light carrier, the Soho, and damaged the fleet carrier, one of the major carriers, the Shokaku, one of the carriers that had been involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, on the Hawaiian Islands. Japan had actually used 6 major aircraft carriers, 6 fleet carriers in that battle. So this was the first time that they had been stopped at all. And so this part of Yamamoto's plan was not successful. They ended up still being limited up here. They could not take over the southern part of the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea, New Caledonia, or Fiji because of the defeat there. but they still had the expectation of being able to establish a base in Midway. So the next major battle, which was the next month, is the Battle of Midway. And Midway is almost certainly the most important turning point in the Pacific War. Again, the Americans knew what the plans were of the Japanese because they had broken their codes. The Japanese plan involved bringing a major fleet to Midway Island, which was a U.S. base, and in the process not only taking over Midway so that they could use it as a forward base for the Japanese, and in doing so, the further out they could push their defensive line, the less likely it was that the Allies, particularly the United States Navy, could attack them. In April, the month before this, the United States had been successful. Jimmy Doolittle, called Doolittle's Raid, they had flown 16 B-25 bombers off of the USS Hornet aircraft carrier and had bombed Tokyo. They did very little damage to speak of in that, but it was a moral victory because it showed we could strike at the heart of the Japanese islands. After bombing Tokyo, the Doolittle Raid, the 16 planes, had landed in China. The point was they couldn't, bombers of that size, and these aren't even the big ones, these aren't the B-29s, but the B-25s could not land back on an aircraft carrier, so they had to land in China at bases controlled by the Nationalist Party in China. But it woke everybody up as to what the potential was. So the Japanese, their goal was to push the line further and further to the east so that the Allies would have less opportunity to attack the home islands. Well, Midway was a key part of that, and they sent a large force. The USS Hornet, the same aircraft carrier that Jimmy Doolittle had flown off of, was present at Midway, and Admiral Fletcher, who was in charge of the Hornet, sent two flights of torpedo bombers. A torpedo bomber is a plane that, rather than have bombs that you drop from an altitude, that skims over the water, drops a torpedo, and then the torpedo does the damage, which means the planes have to be very low to do that. Well, they sent two flights of torpedo bombers that had absolutely no effect. They simply, they didn't hit anything. Most of the planes were destroyed by the anti-aircraft fire. But what it did do was it pulled the Japanese fighters down low because they were attacking these torpedo bombers. And immediately after the second flight of torpedo bombers failed, aerial bombers, dive bombers, and higher altitude bombers came in. And because the Japanese fighters were now down close to the level of the sea, they were pretty much unhindered. They ended up in the Battle of Midway Island. There were 348 U.S. planes, both launched from aircraft carriers and from Midway Island. There were 272 Japanese planes, all launched from aircraft carriers. But the Americans were successful in sinking 4 of the major aircraft carriers of the Japanese Army. They also destroyed a great many of their planes, killed a great many of their pilots, and this was the reason this was a turning point. Not only did they destroy 4 of their most important ships, of most important Japanese ships, but they also destroyed a great many of their planes on those ships and a great many of their pilots. Japan was never able to recover from this. Japan did not have a means nor a plan to be able to make up a loss like that. And so from that point on, the Japanese high command in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew that it was very unlikely they were going to win this war. Again, they were dependent upon quickly being able to defeat and destroy the U.S. Navy at sea, or they felt like a protracted war was not going to be, they were not going to be successful. So Midway Island was a major turning point. The movie Midway is a really excellent movie. I would recommend to you. Yes?
I kind of don't understand how they can be so arrogant that they thought they would win this, and also that they had their plan after, you said, I think they did this in 6 months to a year.
Well, if their plan had been successful and they had been able, their idea was if they could damage the U.S. naval forces enough, the U.S., it's not like they were China, where the Japanese were marching on their land. The Japanese had hoped that they could get the Americans to simply back out of the war and say, this isn't really our fight, it's causing too much damage. The reason why they were confident, and they were confident, is again, for the first 6 months, they were virtually undefeated. They were winning every battle. And so Midway was, and you'll notice too that up until this point, every battle that they fought, the Japanese fought, was an offensive battle. Every battle the Allies fought was a defensive battle. We were very much on our back foot, having to respond to the successful aggression, for the most part, of the Japanese. But this was a turning point, the Battle of Midway, simply because of the destruction of 4 of their fleet aircraft carriers, a great many of their planes, and their pilots. Is there a question?
Yeah, did the Japanese send a force up to the Aleutians and split some of their forces away from the main?
They did. You know your history. The Japanese actually attacked the Aleutian Islands, which were the possession of the United States at that point. You know, they're an extended atoll of islands off of Alaska that we had purchased from the Russians. And so the Japanese sent an attack force up to the Aleutians, and they had 2 goals. For the most part, historians believe that was a diversion more than anything else, because not knowing that we'd broken their code and we knew what their main plan was, they thought that by attacking the Aleutians, which were technically part of the United States, that we might divert some of our naval power there to try to defend against them. And but we knew that wasn't the major thrust of it. Now, the Japanese records say they were interested in taking over part of the United States, because from there, the potential, which never was fulfilled by the Japanese, might have been to follow up along the Aleutian Islands and control all the way up into Alaska, and therefore begin to have a land war against the United States. But that never happened. But you're right, they did actually attack the Aleutian Islands at the same time as Midway occurred. So from this point, the process, Midway Island was the turning point. The Allied forces, in a two-pronged approach, began to respond with a more offensive rather than defensive approach. From Pearl Harbor, which was still the central base for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, they began under Admiral Chester Nimitz to directly cross over the center part of the Pacific, and island hopping was what they call it, where they attacked one island after another that the Japanese controlled. It was a very bloody, very slow process. At the same time, Douglas MacArthur he had been defeated he and his army, he was the army commander in the Pacific, whereas Nimitz was the naval commander. When the army had been defeated in the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur was told to go to Australia, which he did, and so he was in Australia, and Douglas MacArthur and a significant Australian force, supported by the US and Britain, came up from Australia and attacked along these islands, that is New Guinea up through here, with the effort of taking back the Philippine Islands in Borneo, etc., which they did. So you had this two-pronged attack with the Navy under Nimitz coming across the ocean this way, and then the naval forces and the army forces under Douglas MacArthur coming up from here, with much of that being the Australians in support. They continue to do this island hopping all the way across. One of the next most important battles, and it's not just a battle, it's a campaign, was the Guadalcanal Campaign. The Guadalcanal Campaign was down here near where the Coral Sea had happened. It's the southern part of the Solomon Islands here. Again, Australia is here. And this is important because it was the first time that the Allies were on the offensive and the Japanese were on the defensive. They had controlled Guadalcanal. They were building an airbase there, again, in order to have a presence in that part of the world, eventually to try to expand their control and cut off Australia. This campaign lasted for 6 months, from 7th of August to the 9th of February, 7th of August 1942, the 9th of February 1943. It's involved primarily 3 islands that there were multiple battles on. Guadalcanal, the island of Tulagi, which is, the larger island is Guadalcanal, this is Tulagi, and one of the islands there is called the island of Florida, believe it or not. So those 3 islands were where the primary conflict happened. The Japanese had been there since May few months before this campaign began in August of 1942, there were 3 major efforts by the Japanese to retake this island. Again, this is the first time they found themselves on the defensive. So the Guadalcanal Campaign involved 3 major land battles, 7 large naval battles, and daily aerial battles. And it wasn't until having been defeated in all of those battles that the Japanese finally decided they had to withdraw and no longer try to defend Guadalcanal or to take it back, because the Allies had been very successful initially. And so Guadalcanal was a major turning point, not only as a defeat, but the first time that the Japanese were actually driven off of some place that they had had control of previously. Throughout, from this point on, from 1943 on, there began to be more and more aggressive bombing. I mentioned the Doolittle Raid, which had happened in April of 42, just a few months after Pearl Harbor. But strategic bombing began in earnest, really, in June of 1944, and continued up until August of 1945, really the end of the war, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in June of 1944, they introduced this plane, which was the B-29 Superfortress. It had by far the longest range of any bomber in any military. It could travel almost 4,000 miles on one load of gas. And so they began, as soon as they had captured some of the islands, particularly the islands of Saipan and Tinian, which are right next to Guam. Once they had conquered those islands, the Allies began a very aggressive bombing effort. At first, they tried high-altitude bombing of Japanese cities using standard fragmentation bombs, in other words, bombs that just exploded. That simply didn't work, partly because high altitude, and they were flying during the daytime, high altitude in order to stay away from the fighters and to be out of range of the anti-aircraft. The bombs would get blown off course. There are large winds blowing across the Japanese islands, and so that wasn't working. Finally, Curtis LeMay took over later in 1944 in charge of the aerial campaign against Japan, and he instituted night bombing raids, low altitude, using incendiary bombs. Almost all Japanese cities were made out of wood and paper, paper screens and that sort of thing. So over the next year, they ended up bombing 67 cities. I talked about this a little bit in my first talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the birth of the nuclear age. 67 cities, including Tokyo, were significantly destroyed. This gives you an idea. The red sections on these cities, this is Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, which is one of the largest cities, and here the city of Tokyo, and then Kawasaki. Large areas were destroyed by this aerial bombing. Somewhere between 330 and 900,000 people were killed by this firebombing. 473,000, it's estimated, were wounded. On one night, that is the night of March 9th and 10th of 1945, Operation Meetinghouse was a firebombing raid against Tokyo. They killed 100,000 people in that one firebombing raid, destroyed 16 square miles of the city and 267,000 buildings. So at the point of that raid, it was far more destructive than even the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, more people died over time because of radiation poisoning and because of wounds that were received during the atomic bombings. But this, for example, is what the cities that were firebombed looked like. It looked very much like what Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like after the nuclear attack. So these cities were being, for the most part, destroyed by the B-29 attacks, and those continued. 67 cities were significantly destroyed, 67 largest cities in Japan. The next major battle was the attempt by the Allied forces, again, primarily the United States, support from the British and the Australian forces. It was the US and Australia primarily were involved in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as it's called, which was the battle to try to recapture the Philippine Islands. This was the largest naval battle in World War II, and many historians consider it the largest naval battle in history. I'll be right back. The Battle of Leyte Gulf occurred October 23rd to the 26th. It was an American-Australian invasion of the Philippine Islands. The purpose was not only to retake the Philippines, which of course Douglas MacArthur had promised that he would return, not that we will return, but that he would return, and also to deprive Japan The Philippine Islands were a major central point for the delivery of oil and other supplies to Japan, and so an attempt to try to cut them off from those supplies. As it turned out, the Japanese were defeated in Leyte Gulf, and it was the last time the Japanese Navy was ever able to assemble a large naval fleet, because after this they simply did not have the ships left, and what ships they did have were stuck in port because they didn't have the oil to fuel them. They had pretty much run out of fuel. They threw everything they had into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. There were 4 major military engagements. There were initially four naval fleets that 2 of them joined together. So you had the Central Force under Kurita coming in this way, Shima's force, the Southern Force, which gathered together. And then there was a northern force which intended to try, the Ozawa force, that intended to try to draw off Bull Halsey and the Third Fleet, which they did initially, but then Halsey's fleet reversed themselves. And so there were 4 major battles as part of this, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the Japanese were quite conclusively defeated at that point. And it had a major impact on their ability to maintain. They could never get a full fleet out anymore because they simply didn't have the resources or the way to get them there. I mentioned only a few battles. This gives you some idea how many battles we're talking about. This doesn't even include Pearl Harbor and Midway and some of the other areas further to the east. But all of these circled numbers were all significant battles in the Pacific War. This gives you some idea how difficult and time-consuming and how bloody it was to try to do this island jumping kind of thing that they did to try to win back the areas that the Japanese had taken over. The next major battle, which was the largest battle in the Pacific War, was the Battle of Okinawa. I talked about during the discussion of the birth of the nuclear age that the closer the Allied forces got, island by island, to the main islands of Japan, the bloodier it got. Well, the bloodiest, the worst in terms of casualties of the entire Pacific War was the Battle of Okinawa. Okinawa is just 340 miles from the main islands of Japan. It was seen as a necessary forward staging area for what was expected to have to be the rather horrendous and bloody invasion of the home islands. On Okinawa, Japan had between 115 and 130,000 troops, plus they had about half of the Okinawan civilian population, in other words, about 150,000 of the 300,000 people, had been conscripted either as soldiers or as support for the Japanese military. The U.S. landed initially, and to their surprise, they landed in the central part of the island and then first worked their way north. To their surprise, the Japanese did not try to stop them on the beaches. The plan of the Japanese at this point was to let them get on the island, and then through underground emplacements, through various other defensive fortifications that they had prepared, to try to defeat them after they got on the island. This was Leyte Gulf that I mentioned just a second ago in the Philippine Islands. That was the first time that the Japanese had used kamikaze fighters. Here on Okinawa, they even more were sending in planes with inexperienced pilots, because they didn't have many experienced pilots left, to try to destroy the ships. The kamikazes in Okinawa flew 4,000 sorties from the southern. We've been to Kagoshima. Some of you went down to the south end of the island of Kyushu, and there's a museum there because that's where the kamikazes took off from, and they have a lot of the materials that they left behind: letters, personal effects, battle flags, and so 4,000 sorties were flown from that southern part of Kyushu Island. They destroyed 38 ships in the Battle of Okinawa. They damaged 368 more and killed almost 5,000 sailors. All in all, the U.S. suffered 75,000 casualties on the ground, and before this battle was over, 94% of all the Japanese troops had died, and half of all the Okinawan civilians died. The reason it was so difficult is because, as I say, the Japanese allowed the Allied forces to come ashore. But then this is a diagram of some of the kinds of fortifications that they had. They had dug into the mountains and had tunnels that connected to various outlets, each of which had gun emplacements, either cannon or other major weaponry, and they could move from one to the other without being seen, without anything being able to be done. So what happened was there was an extensive use of flamethrowers and of explosives and that sort of thing to try to fight the underground fortifications that the Japanese had built. On the south end of the island, which is where the worst of the fighting ended up happening, that was where the Shuri Castle, it was the original castle and home of the kings of the Ryukyu Islands. Okinawa and the other islands along that area had been part of a separate kingdom called Ryukyu at one point. And Shuri Castle was a major historical and archaeological site because it had been, the castle still stood from the Ryukyu kings. But the Japanese had put their primary command and control center they dug under Shuri Castle, thinking that the Americans might be less willing to destroy it, to get at them, and yet Shuri Castle was destroyed. It's since been rebuilt. If you go back to Okinawa now, you can see the rebuilt version of it, but a lot of historical artifacts and things were damaged there. This image in the lower right is reference to the fact that the Japanese took 1,780 schoolboys as young as 14 years old and made them either frontline soldiers or they were involved in sabotage missions. Half of the 1,780 that they had recruited for the Okinawa battle died in the Battle of Okinawa. This again was one of the indications of how desperate the Japanese were getting in terms of trying to defend against what they believed would be an eventual attack on the home islands. As I say, 94% of the Japanese were killed. The primary generals, General Ushijima and General Cho, committed seppuku when they realized that they were going to get either killed or captured. Then they took their own lives. So Okinawa was a horrendous battle, and it was the place that the kamikazes were more active than anywhere else. 3,862 kamikaze pilots died. And it was very difficult for the Allies to defend against this. Not only was it psychologically very difficult to have these planes crashing into the ships that they were on, and it was very difficult for them to deal with people willing to kill themselves to try to kill the sailors. But it simply was difficult. If a plane is willing to crash, it's very difficult to shoot it down. And so they really struggled against that. Again, one of the reasons for this is that Japan, having expected and hoped for a quick war, had no way to replace the ships, the planes, the pilots that had been destroyed, and so they used this as kind of a last-ditch effort to try to prevent the Allied forces from getting closer. These are examples on Okinawa. 90% of all the buildings on the island of Okinawa were destroyed. This is a group of sailors from the U.S. sailors who heard in May, during the time that this battle was still ongoing, that Germany had surrendered, that the European war was over, and so we were still fighting the Pacific War at this time. Total fatalities, when you add together the Allied forces, the Japanese forces, the Okinawan civilians, 241,000 people died on Okinawa. That's why it's the bloodiest battle of war. And people said, well, what about the bloody battles of Iwo Jima, etc.? Well, percentage-wise, they were as bad or worse, but the number of fatalities, the sheer number of people involved in this battle, makes it extraordinary. Once Okinawa was taken, they were preparing for what was called Operation Downfall, which was to be the invasion of the home islands of Japan in November, following the battles that ended in August in Okinawa. The expectations, and again, I talked about this a little bit for the reason why the atomic bombs were dropped. Various estimates were prepared that predicted that as many as 1 million U.S. military would die in the invasion of the Japanese islands. The Allies estimated 4 million would be wounded, and between 5 and 10 million Japanese would die. The Japanese themselves, the vice chief of the staff of the Japanese Navy, had predicted 20 million Japanese would die. So their expectations were even higher than that.
What was the population at that time?
Of Japan, 70 million. Okay, gives you an idea. We had evidence that just like they had used boy soldiers in Okinawa, that they were training children and civilians to fight, even if it was with sharpened bamboo stakes. If military forces Allied military forces landed on the island. In fact, they expected it to be such a bloody battle that the United States prepared 500,000 Purple Hearts. Purple Heart, of course, is the medal that is given to anyone who's wounded in combat. They expected 500,000 to begin with, 500,000 Purple Hearts to be needed for that because of the number of wounded in battle of Americans. In fact, they still have some of those left. They have not used all of them up since then, even though we've had the Iraq War and etc. Well, of course, instead of this and the horrendous number of fatalities that would undoubtedly have come from this, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. Between 90,000 and 146,000 over the next 6 months died. Initially, half of those would have been from the initial blast, the others from injuries or from radiation that occurred afterwards. 2 days after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union invaded, declared war against Japan and invaded. The next day, August 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Between 39,000 and 80,000 were killed there. Over a period of time, about half of that number, probably 40,000, died in the blast. The emperor insisted on accepting unconditional surrender, which they broadcast his agreement on August 15th, and on September 2nd, the official surrender documents were signed on the USS Missouri, with Douglas MacArthur representing the Allied powers in that. And then the United States, from that point, 1945 until 1952, took over military occupation of Japan. And in the process, by the fact that they did not get rid of the emperor or try him for war crimes, the fact they did not try to force the Japanese to fundamentally change their culture, but rather the Allies under Douglas MacArthur, and I give him full credit for this, although he's not my favorite general in history, the fact is he handled it well, so that in very short order, the Japanese began to realize that we were not going to oppress them, that we were not going to follow the Bushido idea that a defeated enemy was not worthy of mercy. And so we helped to rebuild Japan after that. I'm going to put this up in case anybody has not gotten it yet. Any questions about the Pacific War that I can answer?
What was the major reason of oil embargo prior to Pearl Harbor?
It was the oil embargo and the other freezing of assets was to try to force Japan to get out of China and to not show aggression in that part of the world, which they had, because they had left the League of Nations, so there was no, in 1933, there was no official connection to try to leverage them, and so they left, the West was trying to get them to leave.